Please welcome to the stage Edward Snowden, President of the Freedom of the Press Foundation, and Marta Belcher, Special Counsel to the Electronic Frontier Foundation.
Hi, I'm Marta Belcher. I'm the General Counsel of Protocol Labs, Board Chair of the Filecoin Foundation, and Special Counsel to EFF. And perhaps more to the point, I am one of the millions of people around the world who was blown away by Edward Snowden's disclosures in 2013 that revealed the extent of the US government's warrantless mass surveillance programs. I am so honored and excited to be here with you today. So thanks so much for joining us, Edward.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be with you. Thanks for having me.
All right, well, I want to rewind for a second to 2013. In 2021, it's almost trite to say that we experience so much of our lives through a handful of corporations. And people and regulators all over the world are now thinking about what it means for those corporations to be fallible. So it's hard to remember that back in 2013, no one was really talking about this. It wasn't until your revelations that we really came to understand that what we do on private websites is often used in nefarious ways, including being handed over to the government without a warrant at a mass scale. So could you talk a little bit about the world in 2013, the world in 2021, and what's changed?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about the people who are really worried about corporate nefariousness as it related to the internet, as it related to software, as it related to sort of trade, and they could see how they could abuse their position. They existed, but it was like the Free Software Foundation, right? It was like the Linux Foundation. It was groups that were right-minded. They could see what was technically possible, and they inferred from that what could be happening. But the media, politicians, right, sort of the expert class that is involved in public communication, well, they're not comfortable going based on inference when it's a criticism of the system. And so much of that didn't get talked about. Well, now it's no longer inference, right? We have documented proof. And in a democracy where theoretically it is the people who are supposed to direct the government, elect the government, you know, and say these are the things that matter, these are the issues that should be addressed. We can never meaningfully shift our focus and shift our policies unless we can first come to an agreement. There is a problem. And we can't agree that there is a problem unless we agree on what the facts are. And if those facts are in contention, if they are not documented, if they are not proven, you can never sort of establish that consensus. Well, now in 2021, that consensus is well founded. Everybody knows there's a problem when you talk about digital surveillance, when you talk about offline surveillance, right? When we talk about hyper-local surveillance, when we talk about license plate readers, when we talk about Ring door cameras, you know, being fed into police stations around the country, thanks Amazon. When we talk about Amazon Web Services, when we talk about how Amazon is taking your order flow and then they're sending that on to their own guys to compete or create competing products to people who are selling things on their stores, to Facebook, to Instagram, right, to the endless scroll on your phone that's making a more and more comprehensive dossier of your interests, of your activities, of where you were, at what time, what you were reading at what time, who you were speaking with at what time. People realize that Pandora's box is real, and it is opening, right? And all of the evils that were contained in this box are starting to escape into the atmosphere. And our job as technologists, I think, of those who have any kind of interest in this, those people who are engaged in sort of positive uses of technology that disrupt those systems of control, we need to make sure that that hope remains in the box, right? The hope is the last thing that will come out that will allow us to get away from that. Just when I think about what happened between 2013 and 2021 from a person sitting behind the desk at the NSA, 2013 felt pretty hopeless. Nobody understood what was going on. The extent of surveillance was expanding every year. Our sophistication, our capability was really by orders of magnitude advancing. And meanwhile, just basic encryption to websites was not happening on a regular basis. I just heard from my BFF staffer yesterday, Alexis, that she pulled the most recent statistics, and now, at least in some browsers, the amount of HTTPS traffic is 95% in 2021. That is night and day. It's not enough. It's not all the way there. That's only in browsers. That's only in some contexts. But the idea that mass surveillance was easy and cheap, it was frankly costless. And this is all of our communications getting snatched off the wires just as it transits the global internet. Now those are being closed. Now they're being earned. Now they're being protected. 2021 is just the beginning of a wave, or the consequences of public awareness to the fact that a danger is here.
And so you've talked a little bit about how the internet has improved over the last decade. But the internet, of course, has also changed in a lot of ways that are maybe not as positive. So could you talk, right? So could you talk a little bit about how the internet today is different than what we thought it would be early on, what's wrong with it, and how we fix it?
So one of the things that's a little bit challenging for anybody who's a little bit older, and it's funny referring to myself as a little bit older because I always used to be the youngest guy in the room, and now that's no one. But people who used the internet, the user class of the internet, in earlier iterations had a larger technical burden. Right? It's harder to use the internet. You had different devices, you had different software. Like if you wanted to do anything useful, like get out of like sort of the AOL, the CompuServe model of the internet, you had to understand like what a news group is, or a modem is, how you dial up to different bulletin boards and things like that. Now people buy an iPhone, right? Or they buy a Samsung Galaxy or something like that. Internet is just the Facebook app button. Really terrible, terrible terms like that. They're not universally true. And I think for this audience, they don't hold largely true. But when we think about the absolute standard, what has happened is as technology has penetrated further and further into people's lives, they're less willing at scale to assume that technical burden, right? Burden of knowledge in order to interact with these systems. And so the winners have been the people who make it easy, who have made it approachable, who have made it, by their terms, frictionless, right? But a lot of these frictionless systems, all that really meant, because the cost is still there, the cost has to be borne by someone, is that the costs were hidden, right? The costs were backloaded. The cost was you. It's the story of your life, all of your activities, all of your movements, all of your associations, the social graph, how you spend, what you read, what you like, who you like. And what they do is they front load the joy, right? And they do all of this by, as sort of an EFF lawyer, they put up these terms of service, right? This end user licensing agreement, this click OK to continue. And there's been all kinds of studies that show, even if people wanted to read that, you have more yours to read in a year than you have time in a year to read them. And even if you did, they always say in like the first terms is that these are subject to change at any time and without notice, right? And they do change frequently without notice. So we have, again, what's changed not for the better in the internet is the legal system that regulates these companies in the meat space is founded on the idea that we have all agreed to this. We have all consented to these terms, but we haven't even read the terms. And if we wanted to read the terms, they're not material, they don't last. They're sort of ephemeral. It is all a masquerade. And this means that we are controlled in large part, or influenced at least in large part, by systems that we do not agree to, and we do not understand. That is, the illusion of consent has replaced the fact of consent, and the law has not yet realized or recognized that there is a distinction.
So I want to dive into how cryptocurrency plays into all of this. So for me, and I imagine for you, the most important thing about cryptocurrency from a civil liberties perspective is that it can take the anonymity of cash and import it into the online world. And I have been very alarmed in the last year that governments have been increasingly pushing to extend the mass surveillance of the traditional banking system onto cryptocurrency. So for example, the travel rule or the DOJ's crypto enforcement framework or the FinCEN and FATF proposals. And we've seen exchanges mysteriously delisting privacy coins as well.
Mm-hmm.
And what are your thoughts on that, and what do we do about it?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot here. It all comes back to that fundamental concept that surveillance has become easier. The barriers to performing surveillance at scale have evolved with the advance of technology. We actually still believe things like the idea that cash is anonymous, and that's no longer actually true. Fun little exercise for anybody at home who's doing this. You know those cash counters that you see at like the bank, you know, they can put like a stack of money and it's like, and it pulls it through and it says, these are, you know, of these bills, or these are 30 of these bills, or whatever. Like, you can sort it into all kinds of things. If you make a deposit, if you ever actually go into a bank anymore, which in a lot of you don't. But maybe, you know, you're a drug dealer, go buy your own cash counter. Those cash counters now, they actually scan serial number of every bill, and they keep a database of every serial of every bill that they scan, even when they're going by, like, you know, 130 seconds. And guess what those cash counters are now? Yeah, they're networked, right? And so this is the thing. The same thing is happening to our postal mail. The USPS in the United States, they photograph addressing information for every piece of mail now they process. And these are just the challenges that we face, right? They see it as metadata. Like, maybe they don't know what you spent that money on, but they know that that cash was deposited by this person at this bank, eventually, this business. And the last time that the system writ large saw this bill was over in this state or that, and it was withdrawn by this person at that time. And we have no idea how the federal government is using these programs. We have no idea how the banks are using these programs to perform sort of surveillance and link analysis of how sort of financial flows occur. But then, as you say, then we get cryptocurrency. Now, cryptocurrency, and by this, I'm just going to say Bitcoin, is really failing comprehensively, terribly on the privacy angle. And I've said this again, and people are like, oh, Taproot, look at what Taproot actually does. Taproot does not fix Bitcoin's privacy problem. And there's some arguments that it makes it worse by this sort of fragmented address space, making a forensic sort of flow analysis easier, because you can, this kind of wallet is using an ancient address. They sent a payment to this new person with a new form of address, right? But the change address went back to the old one. So even though there's one input, two outputs, you can tell one was a payment and one was a sort of a refund or a change event. Shouldn't be like that. There's no reason for it to happen. We see so many different privacy coins. Zcash, I have said repeatedly, really does the best in this space with their shielded transactions. The criticism is that, like, these transactions don't occur by default, which is valid. In my opinion, they should happen by default. There are other cryptocurrencies like Monero, privacy coin, which is having a lot of trouble being listed on exchanges broadly, which has sort of privacy by default, but it's a lower measure of privacy. They're just playing a shell game. And those shell games really don't last forever, particularly as technology does better and better. And we haven't seen legally tested in the kind of way that we want to see it done. But they're both great projects. And there are many, many other privacy coins out there. But like you said, we see exchanges starting to go, privacy, that's scary. The way that you fix this, the way that you normalize this, is you make Bitcoin private, right? And I mean the main chain. I'm not talking about putting a layer 2. I'm not saying lightning shenanigans, right? You have to make the idea cryptocurrency is private by design. And once you normalize that, it's fait accompli. And it's really frustrating, I think, for a lot of people in the space that the core development team for Bitcoin has not prioritized this, because the longer they wait, the more obstacles are going to be put in place to prevent that from being the case. Right now, Bitcoin really can't be delisted by exchanges. And the sooner we take advantage of that, the better off we will be.
Yeah, and one of the things that I find so frustrating about working on policy around financial surveillance is that somehow everyone seems to just accept that the financial surveillance of the traditional banking system is totally normal, that it's necessary that banks turn over financial records to the government by default en masse.
And this was never the norm historically. A lot of this flew out of like September 11th with like counterterrorism financing, and like counterterrorism financing at like Bank of America. Like, we want terrorists to be sending financial flows over Bank of America, because then we know what they're doing. We know who it's going to. We can knock on their door and like we can blow up their house, right? The way we deal with these things is really crazy, because we structured these new policies in the panic. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to jump in there, but I think it's important. Actually, maybe you could tell us a little bit more about that. When did these things just start to change from this old paradigm things were in terms of what the government could get from banks and what they can get in?
So, back, one of the original cases around this type of financial surveillance was the Miller case back in the 1970s, where the Supreme Court looked at bank records under the Bank Secrecy Act, because this is all happening under the Bank Secrecy Act, and the way that was being collected, and said, well, look, since you're giving a third party, the bank, your financial data, they can turn that over. You don't have a reasonable expectation of privacy in that. So
because you don't own it, the bank owns it, right? It's no longer your record, it's the bank's record. So the government doesn't need a warrant or anything like that, because the bank can voluntarily provide it. That's what you're saying, right?
Right, exactly. Because you've shown it to the bank, suddenly you don't have a reasonable expectation of privacy in it. And of course, in the 1970s, you can understand where the third party doctrine came from, because the amount of information that you were showing to someone was minimal, right? Like the checks you're writing.
Your library card.
Right, exactly. And then you fast forward to today, and I actually think that if you brought this to the Supreme Court again, this would come out very differently, because we've seen in the last few years the Supreme Court chipping away at the third party doctrine and recognizing that if you have the same, if you have someone's financial records, the things that they're showing to third parties, it's a comprehensive picture of absolutely everything that they do, right? Their whole lives. And so I think this would turn out differently if it went up to the court today. But the thing that I find so weird here is that even cryptocurrency advocates will say, in responding to proposed regulations, things like, as long as you're just regulating cryptocurrency the same way as you're regulating traditional financial institutions, as long as the information that's being handed over about crypto transactions is the same, then that's okay. These are like well-known cryptocurrency advocates. And it's like, there's this stigma that if you support allowing financial transactions to be anonymous, you support money laundering and terrorism,
Yeah, I think it's strategic. I think if you asked a lot of these people privately, they would all say they hate it. They would all say it's a mistake. They would all say they don't do it. But at the same time, I think a lot of these guys are not comfortable being the first to break cover, and they're afraid of regulation, right? The problem with the cryptocurrency space at the largest scale today is the people who make these decisions have the biggest stake in the system, and the system has benefited from the fact that it has not been regulated out of existence, or there's no attempt to regulate it out of existence currently by the structure as it exists today. And so they have become fantastically wealthy. And this puts a lot on the line, right? I'm not saying they have no principles. I'm not saying anything like that. I'm saying they realize how much value there is both for themselves and for everybody else who's bought into these systems by not rocking them. And it's important to remember that sometimes the boat can be bigger than the puddle. And right now, they're all afraid of being, capsized and drowned in the ocean. But there is, like right now, they're in a puddle and there's a rainstorm out there. And the puddle's getting bigger. And I think they need to understand that it's important that we establish these things before the idea that KYC everywhere for everything. We move these, you take something off the exchange and the exchange says, well, you need to identify who owns that wallet. And you need to identify where this came from. You need to identify, where you got these funds from, because, again, like Bank of America can do this to somebody. And they have done this since September 11th. Well, September 11th is not the precedent. That's not the world that we want to live in until the end of time. That's not going to change unless somebody makes a change. The idea of the Bitcoin protocol, the peer-to-peer electronic cash system, is the idea that we can send these payments to anyone permissionlessly. And this is true if it's in your wallet. But how do people fill their wallets today? They get it through exchanges. And these guys are imposing permissioning steps that are intermediary to the transaction. And the only way to defeat that is to allow some kind of purification step, right? Where we remove all of the taint, we remove all of the identification, we remove all of the cruft being imposed at this external level, this external layer in the system, and return it to this idea that we can have direct trade, we can have direct commerce, we can have direct interaction with anyone, anywhere, anytime. Until we recognize that and realize that and enforce that or at least provide opportunity through the protocol level, crypto hasn't gotten to where it needs to be.
Yeah, and there are all these governments today that I'd like to get your thoughts on central bank digital currencies. I personally,
they're terrible, yeah, but go on.
Right, exactly. I personally find this terrifying, right? Like, it's completely terrifying. It reminds me of these photos from the Hong Kong protests where there are these huge lines at the subway stations. And people want to pay for tickets in cash because no one wants their electronic purchases to place them at the scene of the protest, which to me really underscores that a cashless society is a surveillance society. So the last thing I want is for all money to be digitally administered by a government. And so what are your thoughts on CBDCs?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many problems that, like, even if we step away from privacy, we know China is trying out their digital yuan, and the idea, like the hot, exciting idea that was being written about in like Bloomberg on this, is that they could issue money that has an expiration date because it's digitally provided, right? They can set the rules on this. They own the wallets. They distribute this. The tokens they create, they can script however they want. And so they go, well, for economic stimulus, we can give a payment, and if you don't use it, you lose it. But simply the idea that anyone anywhere can revoke your money is terrifying. How can anyone say, we're all going back to gold at that point, like digging in the ground and like burying acorns in the forest like squirrels? There's actually an argument to be made for people doing that for thousands of years. That's why sometimes you find caches of buried coins under some house in England. It's because people recognize, for good reason, you have to be able to store value somehow that can't be confiscated, because confiscation is not always just, even if it is legal. And just to respond a little bit to the Hong Kong thing, I think that's a great point, but it also shows where we are really bad at anticipating threats, and we're very bad at scaling things. You go to the subway and you don't want to use cash because you don't want your ticket to be associated with your card that says you went to this protest at this time. Great, makes sense, good idea. At the same time, you're carrying your phone, and there are cell phone towers at the protest site because there's cell phone towers everywhere in the city. And your phone is associated with your SIM card. Your SIM card is associated with the telecommunications company, and the telecommunications company associates that with your payment information. The phone company still knows you were at that protest site because your phone was at the protest site. And you know, the telecommunications company has all of your billing information. They probably have your address and information, and they provide this to the government. In every country, I don't care where you are, telecommunications companies are some of the most regulated entities on the planet. They are always subordinate to the government and entirely dependent on the government for permission to operate their business. And that means they're basically the least reliable partners you can have in protecting yourself, probably only second to banks. So yeah, I mean, this is really the problem. How do we make sure that someone can ride the subway? How do we make sure that someone can communicate freely? How do we make sure that someone can publish freely? And also maybe privately, because you can't communicate free, and you can't spend free, and you can't associate freely or do anything freely unless you can do it privately in many circumstances, right? And what are those circumstances? People are like, you know, privacy, privacy, privacy. And I don't think this is true in this conference that like people poo-poo it. But when you get these sort of walking corpses that are on the op-ed boards of major newspapers around the world, and they dismiss this again because they're bought into the system. They don't realize the value of rights because they need their rights. When you are established, when you are in the majority, when you are representative of especially the powerful segments of society, you don't need the rights because the rights aren't protecting you against anything. You are in the position where you impose your influence on others rather than against yourself so much. And when you have majoritarian positions, when you have majoritarian leanings, you know, none of this really benefits you. Let me cut this short here, but the point is privacy protects the minority against the majority. It's the people who are different. It's the people who are interested in different things, who think different things, who say different things, who buy different things. They are the ones that need the protections of those rights because they're doing something that is fundamentally different than what the system was presuming, or the presumption that the system presumed people would be operating under when it was created. But that's where progress comes from. If we go, well, the system as it is today is great, you know, and which we know it's not, but if we assume it is, and we go, nobody should do anything different, we want to put all these laws in place to make sure nobody does anything different, great, maybe you will be able to perfectly enforce every law everywhere all the time. Think about how horrible that would be. Think about all the times in history where the law was wrong and the only just thing to do was to break it. This is the kind of thing that I think people in Hong Kong will recognize. And sadly, if we don't get critical mass, you know, we could end up like that.
So with our remaining 5 minutes, I'd like to talk a little about how we don't end up like that. And so for the people in the audience who are building the decentralized web, I would love to hear what you think is the most important for them to keep in mind for their projects, and really to hear in these last 5 minutes your vision of the decentralized web.
The first thing, and I think the most important thing a lot of people forget right now, is getting rich and doing something great are distinct goals. A lot of people have in mind that they can do both at the same time. And sometimes, quite frequently in this space recently, it has been possible, right? But I don't think you should plan for that. I think getting rich is not the goal here. And if it is, cool, you know, do whatever, have fun with your project. But that's not really what it means. What we need are the new capabilities that are on retention, that are designed to work regardless of whether people are bought in or bought out the system. Right now, you know, people are all, it's like bag holders and dumpers, and everything has become so financialized. That's a distractor. Even my own circumstances, right? I just did an auction for an NFT for the benefit of the Freedom of the Press Foundation. I didn't make $1 off of this. Everything went to the Freedom of the Press Foundation. Because I think it's a worthy cause. It's a board there, and just to be clear, I don't take a salary. I've never made any money from dealing with FDF. But thanks to enormous support from people out there all over the world who I'd never heard of before, it sold for over $5 million. And that's that covers the FPF's annual budget. And everybody's like, oh, this money, it's incredible, and like it's great. People FPF, I've never seen so excited. But for me, NFTs, like I'm not a wild fan of them, but when I did this auction, what really interested me was the way that the smart contracts worked, and the idea that somebody like me who has I judgments from the government against the Eastern District of Virginia, which is a federal court, nobody could get in the middle, right? This could be listed. There could be people bidding for the world. It could go, out of this wallet and into this wallet, and it's signed and intermediated. We start to have this idea of permissionless contracting that doesn't, I keep talking about permission to simplify it because I know we're running out of time. The most important part of this space is that it allows us to recapture some liberty that has been lost in these last 50 years, like I mentioned. I mean, you're talking about the bank secrecy. The fact that banks are secret, 1970s, that's not that long ago. Federal warrants, getting all these records and from Facebook and Google and all this mass surveillance stuff, telecommunications company, well, back to the 1950s, 1960s, the only thing warrants could allow them to seize were the fruits and instrumentalities of crimes. That's the ill-gotten goods, right? And the smoking gun, not records and these other things. Liberty is freedom from permission. It's being able to act without having to ask someone, is this okay? Without having somebody to pass a law or a regulation to say, you can do this, right? Just go, nobody said this is explicitly forbidden, therefore we can do it, just to act freely. And this, I think, is what this is allowing us to do. As you said, the internet already allows us to do tremendous things, but it's being exploited, it's being controlled, and the financial aspect is where a lot of this control is entering through. If we can permit people to act without permission and privately in this space, which I think is privacy coins, all coins need to be private or they are failing. This is my position. Because you cannot divorce free trade from private trade. The minute you make free trade sort of public trade, you get judgments from all of these different institutions. You get taint histories and all these analyses, and that's problematic. There are other ways that we can investigate financial fraud, financial misconduct, terrorism financing, and these other things that we've done throughout history before these networks existed. We should not compromise ourselves for the benefit of known bad actors. And again, it's not just your government. Don't worry about the United States government, the Canadian government, or whatever. You got to worry about all of them. They got courts in North Korea, right? They can stamp a warrant too. They've got them in China. They've got them in Russia. They've got them, whoever you don't like, they're all over the place. And I'll leave it there.
Well, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to get to chat with you, and really, really appreciate hearing your thoughts.
It's been an honor. Thank you so much for having me.